Senator Fierravanti-Wells.
Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President. I rise to make a contribution on this important bill, and I'd like to start my comments by referring to an article, an opinion piece in the Australian by Professor Greg Craven on the 27th of July last year. And he states on this issue, and he'd been talking about academic freedom, and most particularly in relation to Peter Ridd, and I'll come to that later. And he states the problem is that those outside the academy increasingly suspect universities are more interested in their public image and not upsetting their Department of Woke than protecting fundamental academic freedom. He says universities typically have two types of problem with freedom of academic expression. The first is corporate. That is, where an academic writes something that could rile a major stakeholder, a sponsoring corporation, a government partner, or frankly, China, and we've seen plenty of examples where that has happened. Vice-chancellors, he goes on to say, understandably but not heroically, feel for their institutional wallet. The second assault, he says, on academic freedom is more insidious because it is internal. An academic strikes trouble because he or she writes something counter to the accepted wisdom of their faculty or university as a whole. This was the challenge, of course, that we saw with the Ramsay Centres, and there was a lot of kerfuffle about that. And they did not, as Professor Craven correctly points out, they didn't fit the dominant paradigm, which was the subversive position. Now, in an editorial in the Australian on the 4th of January this year, the editorial goes on to talk about the blinkered, narrow approach of some universities has been clear in recent years in controversies over Chinese-backed Confucius institutes, Danish economist Bjorn Lomborg's futile efforts to set up a centre in Australia, James Cook University's sacking of outspoken physicist Peter Reid, and problems encountered by the Ramsay Centre on various campuses. And I commend those comments to the chamber. Of course, the recent threats that we've seen from the Chinese ambassador, and of course China itself most clearly in recent times, is symptomatic, and I have said this repeatedly, of the predicament we find ourselves in, noting that there have been years of questionable, defective foreign and trade policy which has made us vulnerable to economic coercion. And those who have been responsible for our fellow traveller foreign policy were prepared to ignore Communist China's skullduggery so long as the rivers of gold continued to flow. A very bad business model, and nowhere was it more obvious than at our universities in their failure to diversify and reliance on overseas students, and most especially on the China market. In fact, it was so clear that they weren't even following the basic 101 business practices of their own business schools about diversification. They were happy to take a lot of money from China, in exchange being prepared to stifle free speech so long as those rivers of gold were flowing. And this was very clear in the evidence that was presented to the Senate hearing and Senate inquiry, which I participated in relation to the Foreign Relations Bill. And I'd like to reiterate concerns that I have previously raised, and I raised in my second reading speech in relation to those bills. And at that time, I specifically referred to the evidence that had been given by the university sector and how concerned I was to note the negative attitude of the universities, not just to the bills, but also that the government would even presume to affect that sector's activities through the enactment of foreign relations bills. Very happy to take the taxpayers' coin, but not happy to conform with Australia's foreign policy and find themselves having to comply with a set of norms and parameters. But more importantly, happy to take the taxpayers' money but not conform to principles of allowing free speech on their campuses. Now, as I said, the university sector, together with, I have to say, a wide chorus of businessmen and women, have urged us to effectively ignore the communist regime's many excesses in favour of the continuation of the rivers of gold. So what has been happening on our university campuses? Now, we know that they have many of our universities in Australia have relied on funds from the Chinese Ministry of Education called Hanban through the Confucius Institutes. And of course, let's not forget that the Confucius Institutes at our university provide teachers, textbooks and operating funds. And in Australia, the first institute was established in 2005, and since then there are now 14 Confucius Institutes located on 13 university campuses, and one only has to look at the disgraceful conduct of universities and university academics led by their Chancellor and Vice-Chancellor at the University of Queensland, and what happened to young Drew Pavlou, to see the insidious way that the Chinese communist regime has infiltrated our universities. And of course, let's look at the tentacles that the communist regime has inserted into our university sector through the 1,000 Talents program. Now, we know that universities do incredibly important research often, and they receive large sums of public money. And of course, we need to protect that intellectual property. We need to protect it from cyber attacks and incursions, especially on free speech. And as I said, it's been very, very clear that quite a number of our universities here in Australia have been happy to turn a blind eye to the activities of the communist regime, so long as those rivers of gold were flowing into their coffers. And that, I think, necessitates this government now enacting a freedom of speech bill. And the fact that we actually have to do this, I think, reflects poorly on the university sector. Now, this bill will provide protections in relation to academic freedom and freedom of speech. It gives effect to the recommendations of the French review, the independent 2009 review into freedom of speech in higher education. Now, the bill will provide a new definition of academic freedom that enshrines in law those principles of freedom of expression that are so important to the life of universities, both for academic staff and for students. Now, the definition closely aligns with the recommendation of the French review, but it also includes some modifications recommended by the University Chancellors' Council, which were developed in consultation with former Chief Justice French. Now, this modification excludes one element, the freedom of academic staff without constraint imposed by reason of their employment by the university to make lawful public comment on any issue in their personal capacities. That was part of the definition originally recommended by Mr French and included in the proposed model code. As part of the consultations on the proposed definition, it has been suggested that this element is more about freedom of speech than academic freedom, and ought not to be conflated with the definition of academic freedom. I have some concerns about that, but I think that at this point in time, it is important that we do, whilst I appreciate the argument for a clear delineation between academic freedom and freedom of speech. That is what we're really talking about here, and I will reserve my comments on that for another time. I'm very pleased to see that in the Illawarra, where my electorate office is based, and the University of Wollongong was very quick to respond to the finding of the French review and completed its own internal review of its existing policies and procedures, and to ensure that it fully complied with the model code proposed by the French review. I'm also very pleased that the University of Wollongong was at the forefront with the establishment of its own Ramsay-backed degree in Western civilisation. Whilst there was some controversy, I have to commend the university for the way that they handled that, and the rather smooth transition to the establishment of the Ramsay degree at the University of Wollongong. Of course, one of the very nasty episodes that we have seen in relation to freedom of speech is in relation to Professor Peter Ridd. And as the former Education Minister Dan Tehan said, and was quoted in an article in the Sydney Morning Herald on the 28th of October last year, he advocates that the legal definition of academic freedom, which had been resisted by some universities, would have protected the sacking of marine physics academic Peter Ridd. And indeed, he said on Sky News that the legal advice that I have is that they wouldn't have been able to prosecute Peter Ridd if this law had been in place. Indeed, in a editorial in The Australian on the 9th of December last year, the editorial says time for action on uni speech. It notes nothing, and I quote, "Nothing better epitomises the conformist climate on our campuses than the appalling treatment of Peter Ridd by James Cook University." Professor Ridd reluctantly became the focal point in the battle for intellectual freedom on our campuses following his termination by JCU. And it then goes on to say that there is a crisis of intellectual freedom and freedom of speech in universities, which is beyond dispute, and the Ridd case is but the most conspicuous symptom of the malaise. For years, the anecdotal evidence has mounted of trigger warnings, safe spaces and no platforming of figures such as Bettina Arndt, who challenged the modern canon of identity politics. Indeed, I'm very pleased now to see that the High Court will be making a determination in relation to Peter Ridd, and I do sincerely hope that it does come down in his favour. I want to conclude my remarks today to say that I hope that this model code will change practices on university campuses. However, I won't be holding my breath. When I see two incidences, and I'd like to put those on the record. One was referred to in an article in the Sydney Morning Herald of the 4th of August last year, and it relates to the University of New South Wales, which boldly urges its students to bring your differences. However, recent experience, and I quote from the article, suggests that the university might be more interested in damage control than an open marketplace of ideas. And this is a test of academic freedom that UNSW can't afford to fail. And of course it relates to the actions taken in relation to Australian Director of Human Rights Watch and adjunct lecturer at the university, Elaine Pearson, and the disgraceful behaviour of the university in relation to what she had been saying in relation to the Chinese government's threats to academic freedom in Australia. But I conclude with something which really appalled me, and which was the front page of the Daily Telegraph, which says, "Woke kills mum and dad, uni radical new gender neutral parenting guide." I cannot believe that my former alma mater, the Australian National University, is prepared to go down the road with this sort of garbage. And can I say to its Chancellor, after having served in this place for so long, how can you possibly allow this sort of thing to happen at one of our universities, which is supposed to be one of our leading ones?